Everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. I'm Sally Gaga from College Coach. For the first two segments, I'll be talking with Shannon Vasconcelos, a regular here on the podcast, College Coach finance expert. She and I will be answering listener questions, so that should be really fun. Hopefully, we'll be able to have Kimberly Aselta, a former admission officer at Babson College, join us to talk about admission to business programs, but we'll see. We've been having some technical difficulties. So anyway, welcome, Shannon. How are you today?
Thanks, Sally. I'm great. How are you?
I am doing really well. Thank you.
Good.
So it looks to me like there are more admission questions than finance questions.
Yes.
So, which I always think is funny because I always think the biggest problem is paying for college over like, I mean, there's lots of colleges. The hard part is paying for it. But so why don't you, oh, you know what? There are questions that I want to ask, but I also wanted to give a quick update. We got some great feedback from a listener about a response that Beth had given. So I'm going to do that quick update, and then maybe you can go ahead and ask me a question. Does that sound good?
Okay. Perfect.
All right. So this is from Todd, and Beth answered a question a couple months ago about test score reporting when his daughter's ACT composite was better than her SAT. And her two English ACT subscores were much higher than her SAT verbal subscores, but her SAT math subscore was better than her ACT math score, enough so that really they wanted to super score the two tests together, which my understanding honestly had always been that's not possible, but things have been changing. So Beth gave very good advice, call the schools, find out. And apparently Clemson said they just wanted the single highest composite, but UNC, I'm guessing this is UNC Chapel Hill, said that they would convert the ACT subscores to SAT equivalents. So cool. There you go, call the school, send them all in. It looks like they'll probably take, in some cases, they will take the highest score. So I thought that was pretty cool. And I wanted to make sure the listeners knew about that.
Right. And that is why our answers are very often, they start with, it depends.
It depends.
It really does.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So the first question for you today, Sally, comes in from Tommy. And Tommy asks, are group prep classes or one-on-one test tutoring better?
Okay. I mean, in general, I would always say one-on-one test, because your student and what your student needs to work on is always going to be a little bit different from what the next student needs to work on. I think this is going to be especially the case for students who are pretty far away from the average. Like a typical test prep class is going to really be shooting towards that average, maybe students who are shooting for a 1200. If your kid already has a 1300 and wants to get a 1400, they're not going to get as much out of that class. They're going to get some of the tips and tricks, but a good tutor, what I've seen is they can really like look at the student's strengths and weaknesses and really tailor their homework so that they're working on the specific skills they need to. So if nothing else, it's a huge time saver to go with a tutor over a class. The other thing too that I'll say is that a lot of high schools are working really hard to make the SAT and ACT like a less painful experience for their students. So they offer classes, but unfortunately the classes through the high schools tend to be, I think, some of the least effective because, and I'm saying this as a former high school counselor, the students all know each other. They know they're not being graded. They chat. They don't take it as seriously even as they would a class that was with students who were not fellow pupils. Mind you, pandemic, this has all been a little different, right? Like everybody's on a screen, so maybe that hasn't been so bad. But when I set up classes for my students, I saw a lot of chit-chatting. You know, I had to go in there and tell them to be quiet sometimes and listen to the poor teacher who was really doing his best to give them some good information. So, so yes, one-on-one test tutoring, if you can afford it. A couple provisos, by the way, make sure that this student, make sure that this tutor can tutor for either the SAT or ACT and can help you figure out which one you're going to be better at, and make sure that it's not someone who just does a little tutoring part-time. I find that someone who's an English teacher who picks up a little tutoring on the side is not going to be as effective. They're going to be great as an English tutor, but they're not going to be as good at a test prep tutor. That's all. So,
right.
Yeah. All right. So on to finance.
Yes.
So Greg says, as you have shared with us, the new FAFSA, free application for federal student aid index, will no longer factor in the number of children in one family in college at the same time. Are you hearing anything from colleges indicating how institutional financial aid offices may also adopt this or choose not to adopt this policy?
That's a great question. And the truth is, we just really don't know yet. And to give a little bit of background, Sally, for folks who may have missed the episode a couple of weeks ago where you and I spoke about all the legislative changes that were happening in regards to paying for college. A bill passed at the end of December called the FAFSA Simplification Act that made a whole lot of changes to the FAFSA form itself, eliminated many of the questions, changes to how the need-based financial aid in terms of federal aid, how that calculation would be done. And one of the big, huge changes for a lot of families is that they removed the splitting of the expected family contribution between any kids you have enrolled in college. Currently, if you have, maybe you your first child applies to college and they calculate a $30,000 expected family contribution for you. And then the next year, maybe a younger child also goes to college. You have two in college, that $30,000 contribution gets split in half between the two kids. And if you had three in college, it gets split three ways. So your total contribution between all your kids is consistent. The changes that go into effect for the 23-24 school year have removed that splitting. So if you have $30,000 contribution for child one, and then a second child goes to school, you also have a $30,000 contribution for them. So you are needing to now come up with $60,000 total, which is obviously problematic for a lot of families. So this is in regards to the federal financial aid calculation. So in determining eligibility for federal aid, subsidized direct loans, Pell Grants, things like that. Colleges can award their own institutional aid any darn way they please. The FAFSA is keeping the question on the form about how many kids you have enrolled in college to give colleges the option. If they want to split the contribution for their calculations in terms of their institutional aid, they can do that if they want to, or they can follow the new federal treatment where the contribution is not split. And we just don't know yet what colleges are going to do in terms of their institutional aid. We have talked to all of us here at College Coach previously worked at colleges. We have lots of friends, former colleagues in college admissions and financial aid offices. We've talked to a whole lot of them, and the pretty consistent answer we're getting is we have no idea yet. They are just trying to get through, this cycle right now. A lot of colleges in a really terrible financial position right now, and they're figuring out how to award their funds for this year and help students who are also really struggling right now. That's the primary focus of colleges right now. We actually also have a former colleague who now works for a financial aid consulting company where she advises colleges about how to award their financial aid in a way that maximizes their institutional interests. She has been trying to talk to the colleges she works with about it, and she's getting the same response that we're getting in terms of they're just trying to get through this year and they have not decided that. So sorry, I don't have a great answer for you at this point, Greg. We just don't know. What colleges I would say are thinking about is not splitting the expected contribution, what will now be known as the student aid index. They're just changing that name. Will save them money. So that's, one determining factor that's going into it. We won't have to award as much financial aid. We can conserve some of our resources if we follow the federal treatment and do not split the contribution between the kids in college. On the other hand, though, colleges also have to worry about all their competitor colleges, all trying to recruit the same students. So if one college says they will split that contribution and therefore they award more generous financial aid, that college is at a competitive advantage. And that might lead more of their competitor colleges to also keep doing the split and not follow the federal treatment. So that's a long answer to we just don't know. There's a lot of factors going into it, and time's gonna have to tell a little bit on this one because colleges for the most part have just not decided yet.
Yeah, well, I think it's good for people to know the backstory regardless, so they don't think colleges are just like, we don't care about this. It's like, no, right. they're hanging on by their fingernails right now, so they're doing the best they can. So
exactly.
Okay.
And then the next admissions question, Sally, comes in from Tina, and she asks, how do you help a student find distinguishing excellence, especially when your student is not an athlete? It sounds like if you're a 4.5 GPA or whatever the superlative grade status is called these days, and you have a 1500 SAT, you still have to find a way to distinguish yourself beyond Eagle Scout or YouTube star. How do you find that passion or that excellence? What ways are there to explore what your student might be capable of, and what your student may find interest in?
So, I mean, first, I want to say that it's true that for the most selective colleges, and by that, we're talking Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, like maybe MIT, Brown, UPenn. I mean, we're really talking about maybe 10 institutions where we need a distinguishing excellence. So before everybody panics, like there are 4,000 institutions in this country. I can personally name probably 300 if you pushed me to it, where like, and the limitations are just my memory. I'm not saying there's only 300 good colleges in this country. It's just my memory. If I could sit down and personally name 300 colleges that are great launching pads for students into their future. So again, like, and they don't need distinguishing excellences. They just want a good kid with decent grades who's taken some decently rigorous courses. That's all, that's what they want. So, so it is true though, like for those very most selective colleges, they want something that distinguishes you. And it's true that being an Eagle Scout is not particularly distinguishing. It's a good solid activity though, and it's gonna work for most places. But they want something that ideally maybe has gone beyond just kind of the local community. I mean, an example of that I would give is I had a student who got into Yale. She had no hook. She wasn't an athlete. She wasn't a legacy or anything, but she was not only a brilliant student academically, she was also in charge of Habitat for Humanity for not just her school, but for the county. So she could point to some really significant leadership. On the other hand, I had a student who went to MIT who didn't have that traditionally defined leadership, but he was one of the people who would regularly update Wikipedia. He researched math constantly by himself and apparently would even argue with his teacher, his like linear algebra teacher about you know, things that happen. So his distinguishing excellence in some ways was really like that kind of intellectual, these really intellectual pursuits. So I want to get across that this can be varied. And what you always want to do is really start with your student and start with what they care about. I mean, first of all, if they don't care about it, they're not going to be able to bring that level of effort to it. I don't think it's just not realistic. So, you know, starting when they're younger, observe the kinds of things that get them really excited. Observe the kinds of things that they like to talk about. Recently, I was on the phone. I mentioned this already in a conversation with Kira, but it was such a classic, such a perfect example. A student on her own started talking to me about her interest in privacy issues. Like she was interested in computer science, but really interested in the ethics and the challenges of Silicon Valley and how it was impacting society as a whole. And I hear that kind of thing so rarely. I thought, this is super exciting. Like, how would you want to pursue this? And, you know, we kind of brainstormed for a while, and that's likely to become a distinguishing excellence for her. But it really had to start with her. I mean, I have a nephew who he is a great kid. He's very bright, going off to college in the fall. But you know what? His main passion is environmental science. So, and the Boy Scouts was what he wanted to do. And it's okay. His life isn't over because he's not going to Princeton. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, so let kids sort of pick what matters to them. And frankly, we were thrilled about the environmental science and all that volunteer work, because otherwise he just wanted to play video games. So realize these are teenagers and encourage them in those really positive ways. And then you can kind of figure out what will work for them.
Perfect.
Okay. All right, so Kim has a question. I have 6 children and no college savings. We do not have twins. How should I approach financial aid planning? My oldest will go to college in 5 years. Are there any programs to help big families that may not have children in college at the same time?
Right. So, Kim, as we just talked about, even if they are in college at the same time, that depending on where they end up attending and the school's policy, that may not make any difference anyway. But I would say in general, there aren't really any special programs for, particularly for large families. The size of your household is taken into account as part of the standard financial aid formula. And that's actually one part of the formula that changed for, or is about to change for the better for the 23-24 school year. They have increased the allowances they give for households of various sizes. And so the bigger your household, the bigger that allowance is going to be. So it's naturally going to be taken into account as part of the financial aid process. I would say, just in terms of some do's and don'ts and, special considerations for a large family that has 6 kids, something I would say not to do, be very cognizant of, is not giving free rein to your first child to, go wherever they want, no matter how much it costs, and, spend down all your resources for the first child. I have certainly seen that happen when families come to us a little later in the process and they've already, spent all their savings down to get their first child through college, and now they've got child 2 or 3. It's usually not 6, but that exacerbates the problem where they, now they're trying to figure out what to do, and they've used up all their resources, and they want to be fair to the next child and tell them they can go anywhere they want, but they don't have the money to pay for it anymore. So just be very cognizant from day one, and when you're making decisions for the first child, how it's going to affect the 5 coming behind them. In terms of what to do for now, you've got 5 years, save as much as you can. Don't worry about what you haven't saved so far. You can start today. And even if it's just a little bit, every little bit does help. Definitely kind of do the math in terms of your budget and set some boundaries for your kids. Look, this is what we can afford, because we can't, again, spend everything on you when we've got 5 kids coming behind you. I think it's great to give the kids some responsibility in terms of paying for college. That doesn't mean too much responsibility. That means probably borrowing some direct Stafford loans, and you can do up to $30,000 total over your 4 years. Giving much responsibility beyond that, I think, is very risky in terms of how much they'll realistically be able to pay back with their, first job out of college. But the kids can certainly take on some responsibility of borrowing a little bit, working a little bit to pay some bills, that kind of thing. And then I think really just keeping an open mind in terms of what colleges they attend. If your resources are limited, think about what you can actually afford. And maybe it's thinking about community college for a couple of years for each of the kids potentially. Maybe it's thinking about public college as opposed to private college, or that private college where your kid really stands out from the crowd and is going to be offered lots of merit scholarships. Thinking about those decisions, which I think, everybody has to think about. College is a challenge to pay for if you only have 1 child and you want to be thinking about all of these things, but it's just, multiplied when you have 6 kids. So just really giving some serious thought and having discussions with your kids early on in the process, so that everybody is on the same page.
Yeah, I always like to tell, I feel like my mom did it perfectly. So I always like to brag on her with this.
Yeah.
I didn't want to go to the public schools in my state, which people thought was crazy because I lived in California, but those schools were too big for me for what I wanted. So my mom said, you can apply to these private colleges, and if it works out, you can go to one of them, but you may have to go to the public school and you need to be okay with that. And I was like, okay. And I was okay with it. It worked out for me to go to private school. I only had to borrow like $15,000, totally worth it, never regretted it. But yeah, she would never have let me borrow $60,000 to go there. And I'm glad for it.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think parents have to sometimes kind of be the bad guy and lay down that law when you're talking about a 17 or 18-year-old kid who has never worked a full-time job, never had to pay back a car loan or a mortgage, and has no concept of what these kinds of numbers mean. Sometimes the parents just have to step in and be the adult in the situation.
Exactly. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and take a break now. Thanks so much, Shannon.
Sure.